It was a quiet evening on a narrow street in the heart of the city, where the gentle hum of the world seemed distant, almost muffled. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting soft pools of yellow light across the sidewalk. Cars drove by slowly, the sound of their tires against the pavement echoing in the stillness. Beneath the calm exterior, however, a tension lingered in the air, as if the city was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. Maria walked alone down the sidewalk, her steps measured and steady. In her late 30s, she had learned to carry herself with a quiet strength, a kind of calm that came from years of perseverance and hard work. A Latina woman, she had faced her fair share of obstacles, both in life and in her career. But tonight, she wasn't thinking about the challenges she had overcome. She was simply enjoying the walk, letting the cool evening breeze brush against her skin. Out of nowhere, a police car pulled up beside her, the engine growling as it came to a stop. Officer Davis, a tall man in his late 40s, stepped out of the car. His uniform was crisp, but his expression was anything but friendly. He looked at Maria with a hint of suspicion, his eyes scanning her up and down. "Identification," he barked, his tone cold. Maria was taken aback, confused by the sudden request. She hadn't done anything wrong, but she was calm, composed. "I'm sorry, officer, but is there a reason you're stopping me?" Her voice was steady, but there was a subtle edge of frustration creeping in. The officer didn't respond to her question. Instead, he motioned for her to show her ID. "I'm just asking for identification," he repeated, his eyes narrowing. "You look suspicious. I need to know why you're out here." Maria stood still, trying to process what was happening. She hadn't been speeding, she hadn't been loitering. She was simply walking down the street. Her mind raced, trying to figure out what she had done wrong. But she kept her composure, pulling out her wallet and handing him her ID. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'm just going home." But Officer Davis didn't seem to care. His eyes hardened as he stared at her, no longer interested in hearing her side. "Just come with me," he said, his voice now cold and unyielding. "You're under arrest." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Arrested? For what? She was speechless, helpless, but before she could even protest, he grabbed her arm and led her toward the patrol car. Her heart pounded in her chest as she was pushed into the back seat, the frustration and confusion rising within her. As the door slammed shut, Maria couldn't help but feel the weight of the injustice. What had just happened? Why was she being treated like this? Officer Davis didn't answer. He simply drove, the car moving down the road, while Maria sat in the back, her mind swirling with questions. Maria sat in the back of the patrol car, the cool metal of the handcuffs digging into her wrists. Her thoughts began to drift back to the years she had spent working her way up the ranks in law enforcement. It hadn't been easy. As a young woman, and especially as a Latina, she had faced more obstacles than most. She remembered her first days on the job, how the veteran officers doubted her, questioned her ability. They didn't believe she belonged, didn't think a woman like her could handle the pressure. But she had shown them wrong, over and over again. Every late night spent studying case files, every risk she took to prove her worth, it had all been worth it. And now, after years of hard work, Maria had finally made it. She had recently received a promotion, one she had been working toward for a long time. She was now the captain of the precinct. It was a milestone, a moment that should have filled her with pride. But instead, she had kept it quiet. She hadn't announced her new position yet. Maria wanted to observe her team first, to understand the culture of the precinct before making herself known. She wasn't interested in grand entrances or celebrations. She wanted to lead from the ground up, quietly, and make sure the changes she wanted to bring were authentic. But now, sitting in the back of the patrol car with her hands cuffed, she felt a growing sense of disbelief. How had it come to this? What was it about her that had caused Officer Davis to arrest her without reason? The car pulled into the station, and the tension in the air thickened. She was led into the building, still restrained, her heart pounding in her chest. Officer Davis was at her side, muttering under his breath. "What the hell was that about?" he grumbled as he escorted her through the hallway. "I don't know," Maria replied, her voice quiet but firm. "But I'd like to know why I'm being treated like this." He didn't respond. Instead, he led her to a holding room and began to process her. He was confused, frustrated, and perhaps even a little angry. He still couldn't understand why she was even in the system, why someone like her would be out on the street in the first place. Before he could finish, Maria spoke again. "Officer, I'd like to remove my mask," she said calmly. His eyes narrowed, clearly puzzled. "Your mask?" Maria nodded. "Yes, please remove it." Officer Davis, still irritated, leaned forward and started to unfasten the straps around her face. The moment the mask came off, he froze. It took him a moment to register what he was seeing. His eyes widened in shock. The woman he had just arrested, the one he had treated with such suspicion, was none other than Maria Garcia, the new captain of the precinct. His mind raced as he processed the realization. Maria stood there, her expression calm and composed. She could see the disbelief in his eyes, the way his jaw dropped slightly as recognition dawned. "No, no way," Officer Davis muttered, unable to comprehend the situation. He looked at her, then at the badge he had just noticed on her uniform. You're the new captain?" Maria nodded, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Yes, I am." The officer stood there in stunned silence, his confusion turning to embarrassment. The weight of his mistake seemed to hang heavily in the air. He had arrested his new captain, treated her like a criminal, and for what? Because she looked suspicious? His mind couldn't reconcile what had just happened. He gasped, clearly rattled, as he stumbled to find words. I don't understand. Why were you even out there? And why didn't you tell me who you were?" Maria's gaze softened slightly, but her voice was firm. "I wanted to see how my officers would treat a civilian on the streets. I wanted to observe how you'd handle a situation without knowing who I was." Officer Davis stood motionless, the realization of his actions sinking in. He had no idea how to process what was unfolding before him. His gaze shifted from Maria to the door, and for a moment, he didn't know whether to apologize or say nothing at all. Maria stood tall in the holding room, her posture straight, but her hands still bound by the cold metal of the cuffs. The weight of the moment settled in her chest, but her calm exterior was starting to crack. Officer Davis stood across from her, his face a mixture of confusion, guilt, and disbelief. He hadn't expected any of this. A quiet anger stirred within Maria as she looked at him, her gaze sharp and unwavering. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke. "Officer Davis, I need you to explain something to me," she began, her voice cold but controlled. "Why did you arrest me? What was the reason? What did I do that warranted this treatment?" Davis shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, his earlier confidence fading. He opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. His mind was still reeling from the shock of recognizing her as the new captain, and he didn't know how to answer. I thought you were suspicious," he muttered finally, his voice lacking conviction. "You were out there alone, and you didn't seem to fit the usual profile." Maria's eyes narrowed. "The usual profile?" She repeated the words as though they tasted bitter in her mouth. "What do you mean by that, officer? What about me made you think I was suspicious?" Davis stumbled over his words, his earlier certainty slipping away. "I don't know, it's just, you looked out of place." Maria let out a sharp exhale, her frustration growing. "You stopped me because I looked out of place. Not because I was breaking any law, not because I was doing anything wrong, but because you decided I was suspicious." She stepped closer, her voice rising, but she remained composed. "And what about the rest of the officers you work with? Do you think they would have stopped me too? Is that how this works here?" Davis swallowed hard, his face reddening. He had no answer. He couldn't justify his actions, and he knew it. Maria took a step back, her anger now barely contained. "I've spent my entire life proving myself, officer. I've worked every day to show people like you that I deserve to be here. I've fought for every promotion, every opportunity, while being overlooked simply because of the way I look, because of my gender and my heritage. You have no idea how hard it has been to make it this far." Her voice wavered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure, her tone growing firmer with each word. She took a moment to let her words sink in, then continued, her eyes never leaving Davis's face. "This encounter, this arrest, it reflects everything that's wrong with this system. You've seen me 100 times before, but never truly seen me. You've decided who I am based on assumptions, not facts. Davis shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. But Maria wasn't done. She had waited years to confront this, to make sure people understood what it for someone like her in a world that rarely gave her a chance. It's not just you, Davis, it's the entire system. It's the years of feeling like I'm less than my male counterparts, like I have to prove myself 10 times over to get half the recognition. Maria's voice cracked slightly, but she quickly steadied herself. And I've done it. I've earned my place here, just like anyone else. But it's not enough, is it? Not when officers like you make judgments based on appearances alone. Davis couldn't meet her eyes anymore. He shifted uneasily, his shame palpable. He had never considered what it must feel like to walk in her shoes, to constantly have to prove your worth, only to be judged by superficial traits that had nothing to do with skill or character. But Maria wasn't done yet. There was more to this, much more. This entire thing was a test, she said, her voice suddenly quiet but piercing. I planned this. I wanted to see how you and the others in my precinct would react when faced with a situation like this. I wanted to know if you'd do your job or if you'd simply follow your instincts and prejudices. I wanted to know if I could trust my team to make fair decisions, or if they'd revert to the same old biases that plague this system. The room fell silent. Davis stood frozen, his face drained of color. His mind raced, trying to process the gravity of what he had just heard. The reality of the situation hit him all at once. He had just arrested the woman who was now his captain, his superior. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The shame was overwhelming. Maria watched him for a long moment, her expression stern but not unkind. You've got a lot to learn, officer, but we all do. You're not the only one who has to do better. Davis stood in silence, his head hanging low, as the weight of his mistake settled on his shoulders. Maria stood tall in the holding room, the weight of her words still hanging in the air. The silence between her and Officer Davis stretched on, the tension thick and palpable. Her gaze never wavered, her focus unwavering as she began to speak once more, her voice calm but firm. The truth is, Davis, she began, her tone quiet but laden with authority, this isn't just about one officer making a mistake. This is about something much bigger. It's about the culture we've built within this department. A culture that allows people like you to make assumptions based on nothing but the color of someone's skin, or the way they speak, or their gender. It's not just about racial or gender inequality, though those are massive issues we can't ignore. It's about the broader prejudice that runs through everything we do. She paused, letting her words settle. Davis shifted uncomfortably, still standing with his head down, too embarrassed to meet her eyes. This precinct, this department, is supposed to be here to protect the community, Maria continued, her voice gaining strength. But we're failing them. We're failing the very people we swore to serve. We cannot afford to keep acting like this, making decisions based on biases that have no place in law enforcement, and we cannot ignore the reality of how our actions impact the lives of others. She took a deep breath, her expression softening slightly, but the gravity of the moment remained. The community looks to us for protection, for fairness, for justice. But how can they trust us if we're not willing to look at our own shortcomings? If we can't be honest with ourselves about the flaws within our own department? Davis finally met her eyes, his face red with shame. His mouth opened as if to speak, but he didn't know where to start. After a long moment, he finally found his voice, his words stumbling over themselves. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't know who you were. I was just doing my job, but I see now that Maria held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Words are easy, Davis, she said, her voice sharp. Apologies are easy, but actions speak louder. You can apologize all you want, but it doesn't change the fact that you made a decision based on assumptions, and that's not something I can just forget. Not until I see real change, real accountability. Davis nodded slowly, his eyes filled with remorse. He understood now that this wasn't just about him, and that his actions were part of a larger, more systemic issue. The realization sank in. He wasn't the only one who had to do better. Everyone in the department had to. Maria took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering as she continued. We all need to do better. We need to confront our biases, not just within ourselves, but within this entire precinct. This isn't about punishing people, it's about making sure we evolve into a force that is truly just and fair. We need to be held accountable, not just when we make mistakes, but when we fall short of the values we claim to uphold. She turned and started walking toward the door, her steps measured but confident. Officer Davis stood silently, watching her every move. He knew she was right. This wasn't about one mistake. It was about fixing an entire culture that had long been broken. Maria paused just before she reached the door, turning back for a moment to speak one final time. "I'll be watching," she said, her voice calm yet filled with authority. "And I won't tolerate any more excuses. You're not just a police officer, Davis. You're a representative of something far bigger than you or me. It's time we act like it." With that, Maria walked out of the station, her head held high, the weight of the moment still pressing on her shoulders, but with a sense of resolve deep in her heart. She had taken her first steps as the new captain, and she knew this was just the beginning. The work ahead of her was immense, but she was ready. The quiet hum of justice had begun to shift in her favor, and she would not stop until real change took root. As she walked through the precinct, she could feel the eyes of her fellow officers on her. They didn't know her yet, but they would. They would come to understand that Maria Garcia was someone who wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right. And she would fight to ensure that everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from, would be treated with fairness and respect under her watch. Maria had already proven herself once again, and this time there would be no doubt left. The next day, the precinct was alive with whispers. The news of Maria's unmasking spread like wildfire. Officers who had seen her as just another face in the crowd now realized who she truly was. Captain Maria Garcia, the woman they had underestimated, the woman they had failed to recognize. Her quiet strength, her calm authority, and her unrelenting determination were starting to settle into the air like a heavy truth. Officers gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about the encounter from the night before. Some still struggled to process the events, unable to reconcile their earlier impressions of Maria with the woman who had walked into their station. Unmasked, a leader in full. "She's the new captain," one officer whispered, still in disbelief. "The way she handled that, I didn't expect it." "She's no pushover," another officer murmured. "She's been through a lot to get here. You could see it in the way she spoke. She's been underestimated her whole career, and now she's in charge." The precinct began to change, little by little. There was an undercurrent of respect building, even among those who had previously been skeptical. Officers started to realize that Maria wasn't just a figurehead. She was someone who had earned her position through grit, determination, and a deep sense of justice. Meanwhile, Officer Davis sat alone in a small break room, lost in thought. The realization of what had transpired the night before hit him with full force. He had arrested his new captain, treated her as a suspect without cause, and all because he let his biases get the better of him. The weight of his mistake sat heavy on his chest. He couldn't stop replaying the moment he had unmasked Maria, the shock that had rippled through him as he recognized her. "How could I have been so blind?" he muttered to himself, his face flushed with embarrassment. The man he had been the night before felt like a stranger now. The truth was undeniable. He had failed her. He had failed everyone. It was then that Davis realized how much he had to learn. His journey, like Maria's, was only just beginning. He had to confront the very biases that had led him to make that arrest and strive to do better. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he had to try. He couldn't let this mistake define him. Back at the precinct, Maria was stepping into her role with renewed conviction. She had earned the respect of her peers, slowly but surely. Her unmasking was only the beginning. The work ahead of her was monumental, but Maria was ready. Her leadership wasn't just about a badge or a title. It was about bringing real change, not just within the department, but in the way they interacted with the community they served. Maria knew her journey was just beginning, but she was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the people who had been overlooked, dismissed, and silenced. And with every step she took, she was one step closer to making the precinct a place of true justice. The story of her leadership, of her strength and vision, would inspire change. It would transform the department, and it would reach out to the community they swore to protect. And Maria Garcia, the woman who had been underestimated for so long, would prove that sometimes the most powerful leaders are the ones who lead with compassion, conviction, and a relentless desire to make the world better for everyone. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you were as inspired by Maria's journey as we were. Her strength, resilience, and determination are a reminder that change begins with us, and it's up to us to make the world better for everyone. If you enjoyed the story, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of our future stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so make sure to comment below. What did you think of Maria's leadership? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to prove yourself? Share your story with us. And if you believe others could benefit from hearing this story, don't forget to share it with your friends and family. Together, we can inspire even more change. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.